So in this video we're going to talk about Athens and Sparta. And in ancient Greece there were over 1,000 poleis, and obviously not all of these could be the same. There were some differences, but in this video we're going to talk about the two main ones, the two main Greek poleis, and those were Athens and Sparta. So we'll start with Athens. Athens was the most populous, the largest, and the best documented Greek polis from ancient times. And Athens was it had a very mighty fleet, which to some extent also contributed to the development of democracy there. And Athens is known for being the birthplace of democracy. That's where democracy was born. That's their political system that other Greek polis adopted, and it became a thing afterwards, but that's where it was born. And classical Greece is the birthplace of Western civilization, and if you want to learn more about classical Greece, you can watch the previous video. In this video, however, we're going to focus more on the social and the political life of Athens and Sparta. So since Athens is best known for its democracy, that's where we'll begin. Democracy in Athens was born around 508 BC, and that's how other Greek polis came to know of democracy and adopted democracy. But not all Greek polis adopted democracy, some did. And their democracy was a bit different than our democracy. Firstly, it was a democracy centered around voting on issues and not representatives. So right now we choose representatives who decide on our behalf, but they decided political decisions themselves. The citizens decided that. And secondly, the citizens in Athens were a bit different. Not everybody could become a citizen. You had to be free, you had to be a male, and you had to be an adult, in addition to having Athenian mother and father. But slaves and children and laborers and foreigners and women could not become citizens. So the rights of non-citizen inhabitants of Athens were a bit limited. They weren't the same as the citizens who lived in Athens. Firstly, we'll discuss the position of women in Athens. Despite Athens being such a civilized society, the women in Athens did not have the same rights as the men did. The women in Athens had lower status to men in Athens. They weren't able to gain citizenship, first of all. Secondly, the men could have lovers that weren't their wives, and while if the woman cheated on her husband, or if they were molested, the man had the right to divorce her, but the women could not divorce their husbands. That was something only men could do. But the thing is that there wasn't just these women that existed in Athens. There was also another group of women which were financially independent, and they were known as friends, they called it. I've forgotten the Greek word for it, but these women could associate with men, discuss issues with men, and they weren't a part of the family structure in Athens, but they could be the priestess, or they were a bit more free, and they had more rights, or I don't know, but I think more rights than other women. Likewise, slaves could also not become citizens, and that's perhaps not very surprising, but slaves were actually a very big part of Greek society, and the average they were seen as a necessity by the average family. And not only did they do domestic chores, but they were also seen doing chores and tasks for the government, for the public. But slaves could pay for their freedom, but of course they had to have a certain amount of money, which was hard to gain. And then there's another group of inhabitants who could not become citizens, and that's the immigrants. And the immigrants were called the medics, and these people would get recognized officially, but the thing was that they had to pay taxes in return for their recognition. and they could become citizens, but it was very hard. Firstly, they had to prove their loyalty in some way to the polis that they were living in, and that was obviously a big thing to do, a hard thing to do. Mostly the Greeks did not like foreigners. Now we're going to talk a bit about the political institutions, and that's probably something that Athens is best known for. And the three main political institutions in Athens were the ecclesia, the assembly, the bowl, the council of the 500, and the courts. So we'll start with the assembly, and the assembly was a place where any citizen who had completed their military training, they could come, they could discuss issues, political issues, and they could vote on those political issues. And the person who was speaking, who spoke about political issues, had to be very talented, because it was very hard to sway these publics. The important political issues required 6,000 people to vote, while the average number of people attending the assembly was 5,000. So even though anybody could speak, it was required for the speaker to be talented and educated in this rhetoric. The assembly met 40 times a year, and one more task that they had was to elect 100 officials from the citizens, because most of the officials were chosen by lot, but a few of the officials were chosen by the assembly, and the officials that were chosen by the assembly had a lot of power. So it was a very important task in Athens. So that was a bit about the assembly. Now we're going to talk about the council. And the council of the 500 had 500 members, obviously, and every tribe in Athens, there were 10 tribes in Athens, and every tribe in Athens would select 50 men who were 30 years or older to represent them in the council. These men, their task was to draft issues before they were discussed in the assembly. Not only to draft issues, but to review issues, draft issues, and then to tell the citizens what those issues were, so that they had the time to prepare for these issues. It was obviously a very important task, because when they drafted issues, these were the issues that would later result in political decisions, right? But the funny thing is that these people were chosen by lot. Any of the citizens could be appointed this task of drafting and reviewing issues. Likewise, the members of the courts were also chosen by lot. Anybody could become a part of the jury. And what happened in the jury was that people voted on who would get punished and who would be set free. And usually there were around 501 to 1,501 members of the jury, while a political decision, or not a political decision, while a person was being condemned for their crime, and the number of members depended on the seriousness of the crime, because Athenians believed that it was more just to have more members in the jury. So that was Athens. Now we'll talk a bit about Sparta. And Sparta was not as democratic, not as culturally rich, not as densely populated as Athens was, but still it was recognized to be a very mighty polis, and the reason being that they had a very, very strict focus on discipline and military training. From boys as young as 7 would start their military training, and that's why they produced very, very good warriors, and they played a very big role in the Persian wars, despite the fact that they weren't as big in number as Athens was. And the political life in Sparta was not as democratic as Athens was. Despite them having some democratic elements, they weren't really democratic. They were known as an oligarchy, and an oligarchy is a state that is governed by the minority of people. And in Sparta, a very few people had most of the power to influence politics. The average citizen could not influence politics very easily. Even though Sparta was not a democracy, it did, however, like Athens, have an assembly and a council. but the institutions did not work in the same exact way as they did in Athens. Firstly, in Sparta, the members of the assembly had to be 30 years old or older, and the members of the council had to be 60 years old or older. And the assembly did not hold most of the power like they did in Athens. The council held much more of the power. In Sparta, the council had members who were rich, who were the richest landowners, and they were over 60, so they were very politically influential. So the assembly did not have the same power as it did in Athens. And also, the reason why the age for taking part in the assembly was 30 years old was because before a man was 30 years old, he was expected to solely focus on his military career, so that they couldn't have a normal life. They couldn't have like a proper family. They couldn't be family men. They couldn't participate in politics. They had to just solely focus on their military career. The members of the council, they were very politically influential, as mentioned, and the reason for that was that they would sit for a lifetime. In Athens, they would get changed every year, but in Sparta, they would sit for a lifetime, and they were usually not usually. They were never chosen by lot. They were chosen, I think, on the basis of their influence, on the basis of how rich they were or how influential they were. Sparta was also discriminating against foreigners, and they really suppressed people who did not belong to their race, even though they could be Greeks, but if they weren't Spartans, if they weren't ethnically Spartan, they were suppressed and discriminated. And especially the Helots were almost treated as state-owned serfs or slaves. They were supposed to do all of the work. Any work that was deemed unworthy by the Spartans was allotted to people of other races. And sometimes the Helots would fight alongside the Spartans in wartime, but in peacetime, the Spartans, and the reason why they trained so much so hard was that they wanted to suppress the uprisings that could be born. The Helots were twice as many in number, and it was actually the Helots who were living in Sparta before the Spartans arrived. So then they didn't want a revolt, so they suppressed them and they became very strong. Women in Sparta, however, were treated a bit better than they were in Athens. Women could own property, manage property, they could participate in sports, they could be educated to a certain degree in arts mostly, and they were also a bit more freer, because Spartans believed that they could benefit from the involvement of women in society. Of course, they weren't the same. They didn't have the same rights as women have today, but it was better than the situation in Athens. But what happened to these two Greek polises, and how did they came to an end? How did the Golden Age came to an end? So what happened was that after the Persian Wars, the Greeks had unified themselves in the Delian League, and Athens was dominating the Delian League, and this dominance annoyed Sparta. And not only that, they were also very politically involved in the matters of other poleis. So Sparta and Athens ended up in a conflict along with their allied, and that resulted in weakening of Greek poleis, and Sparta actually won the conflict. So the Golden Age of Athens came to it. Because the poleis had been weakened, they were now vulnerable to threat, and that threat came from Macedonia. King Philip II, the father of Alexander the Great, he invaded Greek poleis, and he himself, actually Macedonia was kind of Greek because they spoke a dialect that was Greek, but they were considered to be non-Greek by the Greeks. They were considered to be backwards and not very culturally rich. Yes, so that was Athens and Sparta. In the next video, we're going to talk more about Alexander the Great and Hellenism and Macedonia.